In the autumn of 1868, a woman in a cattle settlement on the southern plains buried her husband on a Wednesday afternoon and was back at the store counter on Thursday morning. The man who had come to offer his condolences found her there, already serving customers, already calculating the cost of flour and salt and lamp oil, already making the mental calculations that survival required. He asked, because he could not help himself, how she was managing. She told him she was managing because she had to, and could he please move so she could reach the supply ledger. She was 31 years old. She had 4 children. The store was the only source of income the family had, and the banknote on it was due in 60 days. There was no time for grief in any form that the outside world would have recognized as grief. There was only the problem of what happened next. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you are about to hear is not the version most people know. The frontier widow is a figure who appears in the history of the American West in such numbers that she should be one of the central characters of the mythology. She is not. The mythology of the frontier is built around movement and conquest and masculine agency, and the widow is a figure associated with stillness, with loss, with the aftermath of the action rather than the action itself. She is the woman left behind when the adventure goes wrong, but the historical record tells a different story. The frontier widow was not a passive figure of aftermath. She was, frequently, one of the most consequential agents in the settlement of the American West, operating under conditions of material and legal constraint that would have defeated anyone who was not driven by the very specific desperation of having no alternative. She built businesses, ran ranches, argued with courts, raised children, and in some cases created institutions that outlasted her by decades. She did all of this while occupying a legal and social position that was, in most territories, barely better than non-existent. That gap between what frontier widows actually accomplished and the recognition they received in their own time and in the history that followed is the subject of today's story. Let me start by asking you something. If you think about the Wild West, who do you picture? Cowboys, outlaws, lawmen, pioneers, maybe a school teacher or a saloon girl at the edges. Now, how many widows come to mind? How many women who had lost their husbands and were running their households and businesses alone in territories where the nearest neighbor was sometimes miles away and the nearest judge was sometimes 2 days' ride in the right direction? If you want to understand the real history of the frontier, you need to understand those women. Subscribe now if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling us what you know about women in the Wild West, because we're about to complicate whatever picture you have. The death rate among men on the frontier was extraordinarily high, and it is important to understand this not as an abstract statistical fact, but as a constant presence in the lived experience of frontier women. Men died in mining accidents, in cattle drives gone wrong, from Indian raids in territories where the conflict between settlers and indigenous people was ongoing and violent, from illness that the frontier's thin medical infrastructure was inadequate to treat, from gunshot wounds that occurred with a frequency that the mythology presents as exceptional, but that the historical record presents as disturbingly common, and from the sheer physical attrition of frontier labor at a level and duration that the human body was not designed to sustain. The result was a large and consistent population of women who found themselves widowed at ages that ranged from the late teens to middle age, in environments that offered them very little in the way of institutional support, legal protection, or social mechanism for navigating the transition. What did widowhood actually mean, practically, for a woman on the frontier in the 1860s through the 1880s? It meant, first, an immediate crisis of economic survival. On the frontier, most economic activity was not passive investment. It was active labor. A ranch required daily management. A farm required constant seasonal attention. A store required someone behind the counter every day it was open. The death of a husband meant the immediate cessation of the labor that kept the family's economic engine running, and it meant that the widow had to either replace that labor herself, find someone else to provide it, or watch the enterprise she and her husband had built together collapse. In the East, a widow in this position had options that the frontier rarely offered. She could return to her family of origin. She could move to a city where wage labor was available. She could rely on community institutions, churches, charitable organizations, extended family networks that had the density and stability to provide at least minimal support. The frontier offered none of these things in any reliable form. Extended family was typically thousands of miles away. Churches existed in some settlements, but were not consistently present across the territories. Charitable institutions were almost non-existent. Wage labor for women, outside of a small number of specific occupations, was not available in most frontier environments. The frontier widow's options were therefore stark. She could remarry, which required finding a willing partner in a social environment that often did not provide many options, and doing so quickly enough that the economic crisis created by her husband's death did not consume everything before a new husband could address it. She could find a way to run the existing enterprise herself. She could sell whatever the family had managed to accumulate and try to generate enough capital to start something new. Or she could fail. Failure on the frontier was not merely a financial concept. It meant the loss of the homestead, the loss of the children in some cases if she was judged incapable of providing for them, the reduction to a state of dependence on whatever community charity existed, and the effective end of whatever claim she might have had to the social standing of a respectable frontier woman. The women who refuse to fail are the ones whose stories the historical record has preserved, often in fragments, often in the records of courts and land offices and newspapers rather than in the kind of personal writing that would have made their inner lives more accessible. But even in those institutional traces, their character is visible. Now let's talk about the legal situation, because it was both more complicated and more consequential than most people realize. The legal status of women on the frontier varied significantly by territory and state, and it was changing throughout the period we're discussing in ways that directly affected what widows could and could not do. In most American jurisdictions before the middle of the 19th century, a married woman had almost no independent legal existence. She could not own property in her own name, could not enter contracts, could not sue or be sued, could not control her own wages. All of these rights were subsumed into the legal personality of her husband, a doctrine called coverture that English common law had carried into American jurisprudence. Widowhood dissolved coverture. When a woman's husband died, she recovered the legal existence that marriage had suspended. She could own property, she could enter contracts, she could conduct business in her own name. This was a significant legal restoration, but it came at a moment of maximum vulnerability, when the person had just suffered a major loss, was often in immediate financial crisis, and was operating in an environment that had not prepared her for the independent exercise of legal agency. Many frontier widows encountered this legal landscape for the first time in the immediate aftermath of their husband's death, often in the context of a financial problem that required urgent resolution. They were navigating probate courts, land claims, creditor demands, and business arrangements that they had never had to manage before, in legal systems that varied by territory and were often inconsistently applied, with lawyers who were sometimes helpful and sometimes predatory, in communities that were often watching with a mixture of sympathy and calculation to see what a woman alone could actually manage. Some of them managed remarkably. The historical record contains multiple instances of frontier widows who took over a husband's business or ranch and not only kept it operational, but significantly expanded it. These women were not operating in a social environment that supported female business leadership. They were operating in an environment that assumed female incompetence in these domains and watched for evidence of it with a critical attention that male business owners simply did not face. When they succeeded, the success was often attributed to the help they must have been receiving from some man, visible or invisible, rather than to their own competence. When they failed, the failure was attributed to the inherent unsuitability of women for business. The women who went to court to defend their property rights, their land claims, their business interests against creditors or relatives or neighbors who saw opportunity in their vulnerability, are particularly interesting figures in the historical record because the court documents they generated provide a level of detail about their situations that other sources often do not. A widow in a mining district in the early 1870s, whose name appears in the records of a territorial court, had been running her deceased husband's freight business for 8 months when a creditor attempted to seize the business's primary asset, a team of draft horses, on the basis of a debt her husband had incurred before their marriage. She appeared in court without legal representation, argued her own case on the basis of the marital property laws of the territory, and won. The judge's written decision noted with what appears to be genuine surprise that her knowledge of the relevant statute was as precise as that of any attorney who had argued before him that term. She had taught herself the law because she needed to know it, because her survival and the survival of her children depended on it. This was not exceptional on the frontier. It was a pattern. But here's the part of the story that the mythology never tells, and it's the part that changes how you understand everything else. The remarriage pressure that frontier widows faced was relentless, immediate, and backed by genuine economic logic that made it very difficult to resist. A woman alone in a frontier environment was not merely socially unusual. She was genuinely vulnerable in ways that remarriage could address. She needed physical protection in environments where violence was not uncommon. She needed labor that she alone could not provide for certain kinds of enterprise. She needed social standing that the status of wife conveyed in ways that the status of widow did not. But remarriage carried its own risks that the frontier women who wrote about their situations acknowledged with a frankness that is striking. A new husband brought with him legal rights over everything the widow had managed to preserve or build in the interval between husbands. He had the right to manage her property, to control her income, to make decisions about her children that she could not override. The widow, who had successfully defended her freight business in court, could, upon remarriage, find herself legally unable to make decisions about that business without her new husband's consent. This tension produced a category of frontier widow who chose, deliberately and sometimes at significant social cost, not to remarry. Women who had experienced the independence of legal agency, who had proved to themselves and occasionally to their communities that they were capable of running a business or a ranch without a man's direction, sometimes chose to preserve that independence even when remarriage offered material advantages. The social judgment they faced for this choice was often harsh. An unmarried woman of working age who was not a widow by recent bereavement and who was not actively seeking remarriage was a figure that the frontier social categories did not easily accommodate, and the discomfort she produced was often expressed as criticism. Some of these women found each other and created household arrangements that the historical record documents, but that contemporary commentators rarely described with any precision beyond the language of necessity. Two widows farming adjacent claims who combined their households for practical reasons. A widow and her widowed sister who ran a boarding house together. These arrangements were understood publicly as economic necessity, and they may have been exactly that, but they also represented a social form that existed at the edge of what the frontier's gender norms could accommodate. Women building households and economic units that did not center on male authority. The children in these households occupied a position that the period's courts and social institutions regarded with anxiety. A widow's right to custody of her children was not legally secure in most frontier jurisdictions. Husbands' families had legal claims that could be, and sometimes were, exercised when a widow's resources were insufficient to meet the community's standards for child welfare. The threat of losing children was one of the most powerful forces driving frontier widows toward remarriage, even when remarriage was not in their other interests. Courts in this period were not operating from a principle that the mother's relationship with her children was presumptively the primary legal concern. They were operating from a principle that children required the stability and resources of a proper household, and a proper household, by definition, had a male head. The women who fought these cases in court, who argued against relatives-in-law and neighbors and territorial judges that they were capable of providing for their children without the mediation of a new husband, were doing something that required a combination of legal knowledge, personal courage, and financial resources that not everyone could assemble. When they won, which they sometimes did, the victories were not celebrated as women's rights victories in the language of the period. They were celebrated, if at all, as individual triumphs of character, of the quality of the particular woman, rather than of a principle with broader application. The frontier territories and states were, in this period, ahead of most of the rest of the country in one specific area of women's legal rights: property ownership. Wyoming Territory granted women the right to vote in 1869, a fact that is now reasonably well known. Less well known is that the same period saw several western territories and states establish or expand women's property rights in ways that directly affected the practical situation of frontier widows. These legal changes did not resolve all of the difficulties widows faced, but they provided tools that women could use, and the historical record shows that some of them used those tools with considerable effectiveness. What drove these legal changes was not purely philosophical commitment to gender equality. It was, in significant part, practical frontier politics. Territories needed to attract settlers. Women who could own property independently were more likely to settle in territories that protected that right. Men who had accumulated property and needed it to pass to their wives rather than revert to the territory or to distant relatives had an interest in legal frameworks that protected widows' inheritance rights. The intersection of practical interest and legal reform was not purely idealistic, but the results it produced were sometimes genuinely significant. And this brings us to the thing that most surprises people when they actually look at the history of frontier widows. These women were not peripheral to the story of the West. They were central to it in a way that the mythology, with its exclusive focus on male agency, consistently obscures. The homestead claims that frontier widows maintained, defended, and in some cases expanded, provided the legal basis for land ownership patterns that persisted for generations. The businesses they operated, the stores and boarding houses and laundries and freighting operations, provided the economic infrastructure of frontier settlements that would have been significantly less viable without them. The children they raised, alone, under conditions that the period's gender norms insisted required a male authority figure, grew up in households where competence and independence were not theoretical virtues, but demonstrated daily realities, and the evidence in their own later accounts suggests that this shaped them in ways that had lasting effects. The women, who appear in the margins of frontier history, in the court records and the land office documents, and the occasional newspaper account that bothered to notice them, were not waiting to be rescued or replaced. They were working. They were solving problems. They were making decisions in environments that had been designed to assume they would not have to make decisions, and they were making those decisions with a practical intelligence and a determination that the mythology, in its obsession with male heroism, has consistently failed to honor. A final note on what happened to these women as the frontier closed and the territories became states and the wild open landscapes of the 1870s became the organized agricultural and commercial regions of the early 20th century. Some of them prospered. The businesses and ranches they had held together through the difficult years became, when economic conditions improved, genuinely viable enterprises that supported them and their children into old age. The legal rights they had exercised in the frontier period, the property ownership, the business management, the independent legal agency, became normal and unremarkable as social expectations shifted. Some of them did not prosper in any material sense, but survived with the particular dignity of people who had faced what they were given and not been defeated by it. They appear in the census records of the early 20th century as women of some age living alone or with grown children in the same counties where they had been widowed decades earlier, still on the land, still there, and some of them disappeared from the historical record entirely, absorbed into the anonymity that the period reserved for women who had not done anything dramatic enough to be noticed or swallowed by the poverty that the frontier so efficiently produced in people who ran out of luck or resources or both. But they were all there. They were all doing what survival required. And the West that we romanticize, the West of cattle drives and gold rushes and frontier justice, that West was built in significant part by women who had lost their husbands and gotten back to work the next morning because there was no alternative, and who never appear in the mythology because the mythology was not designed to see them. Mystery Wild West is designed to see them. That is what this channel is for. Subscribe if this matters to you. Share this with someone who needs to know the real history. And leave a comment telling us, was there a woman in your family history who was one of these women? Because there might have been, and you might not even know it. The frontier widows built more of the West than history has acknowledged. It is past time to acknowledge it. There is a category of frontier widow that the historical record captures only in fragments, but that fragments reveal as a distinct and important type. The woman who had not wanted to come west in the first place, and who found herself widowed in a place she had never chosen to be. The Great Migration West was, in most cases, a decision made by men. Husbands decided that opportunity lay west. Husbands decided that the farm in Ohio or the plot in Tennessee was insufficient, and that the promise of land in Kansas or Oregon or Colorado was worth the risk and the journey. Wives went because they were married to the men who decided, because their legal and social options for refusing were minimal, and because the alternative to following their husbands into an unknown landscape was the rupture of everything that gave their lives its social structure. The diaries of overland trail migrants are full of women who made this calculation explicitly. They noted, sometimes with striking directness, that they had not wanted to go, that they had agreed because their husband's will in such matters was effectively law, that they had said goodbye to their mothers and sisters and neighbors and friends, knowing it was likely a permanent goodbye, and that they had carried that grief across 2,000 miles of increasingly alien landscape to a place that bore no resemblance to anything they had known. When their husbands died in that place, these women faced a version of widowhood that was complicated by the specific weight of displacement. They were not widowed in a community where people knew them, where extended family was accessible, where returning to a familiar environment was a realistic option. They were widowed in places where they might have been living for only months or a few years, where their social networks were thin, where the cost of returning east, if they could manage it at all, might be more than they could afford either financially or practically. Some of them went back. The historical record contains cases of women who, after their husbands died, sold or abandoned whatever the family had accumulated and made the return journey east, often taking their children back to grandparents and aunts and uncles who were better positioned to help raise them. This choice, when it was available, was often the rational one, but it was not always available. And for some women, by the time their husbands died, there was no longer anywhere specific to return to. Parents had died, siblings had scattered, the community they had left no longer existed in the form they had known it. These women, doubly displaced, widowed in places they had not chosen, and unable to return to places they had come from, represent a category of frontier suffering that the mythology is completely unprepared to address. They do not fit the narrative of heroic settlers building a new civilization with willing determination. They fit a narrative about people being swept by forces larger than themselves into situations they had not chosen, and finding ways to survive in those situations because surviving was all that was available. The children born to these women in displacement occupied an interesting generational position. They were, by birth and upbringing, products of the frontier, even if their mothers had arrived there involuntarily. They did not know the places their mothers had come from. They knew the specific landscape, the specific community, the specific economy of wherever they had grown up. When their widowed mothers talked about Ohio or Tennessee or Virginia, those places were abstractions to the children, places belonging to a world that had existed before them and that had no claim on their experience or their identity. This generational transition from the reluctant migrant who carried the old world with her to the child who knew only the new one is one of the quieter but more profound transformations in the social history of the frontier West. And it happened, in significant part, in the households of frontier widows who were holding their families together in places they had not chosen, and making of those places the only home their children would ever know. Let us talk about the economics of widowhood in more specific terms, because the abstract language of hardship conceals a set of practical realities that are both more varied and more interesting than the general picture suggests. A frontier widow who inherited a working ranch faced a set of problems that were distinct from the problems facing a widow who inherited a town lot with a small store on it, which were in turn distinct from the problems facing a widow who inherited nothing but debts. The specific economic circumstances of widowhood varied enormously, and the strategies that women developed in response varied accordingly. The ranching widow situation was perhaps the most dramatic in its immediate demands. A cattle operation required continuous labor, animals needed daily attention, fence lines required maintenance, water sources needed management, and the seasonal rhythms of branding, calving, and cattle drives ran on schedules that did not accommodate the personal crisis of a husband's death. A woman who found herself solely responsible for a cattle operation typically had a very short window in which to make consequential decisions about what to do with it before the operation began to deteriorate from inattention. Some of these women hired managers or foremen and supervised the operation while delegating the physical labor they could not themselves perform. This strategy required both the financial resources to pay wages and the managerial capacity to oversee employees effectively, and it exposed the widow to the risk of being exploited by the men she employed, who understood that she needed them in a way that her husband had not. The historical record contains both examples of successful managerial arrangements and of employees who systematically cheated widowed employers while maintaining the appearance of faithful service. Other ranching widows simply learned the physical skills the operation required, working alongside whatever help they could afford to hire, and developing competence in areas, horsemanship, cattle management, basic veterinary care, that the gender norms of the period had not prepared them for. The accounts left by women who took this path describe a steep and demanding learning curve conducted under the pressure of an operation that couldn't wait for them to learn at a comfortable pace, and with the additional challenge of male employees and neighbors who sometimes tested their authority in ways that their husbands would not have faced. The town widow, with a small commercial enterprise, faced a different set of challenges. Commercial operations in frontier towns were embedded in the social networks of credit, reputation, and personal relationship that governed all frontier economic life. And those networks had been built by the husband rather than the wife in most cases. A widow who took over a general store or a hotel or a blacksmith operation was taking over not just the physical enterprise, but the web of relationships that made it viable, and not all of those relationships transferred smoothly to a female proprietor. Credit was the most immediate problem. Frontier business ran on credit extended by suppliers, and that credit had been extended based on assessments of the husband's character and capability. A widow had to establish her own creditworthiness from scratch, often in a context where her gender was itself a factor that some creditors used to discount her reliability. The women who successfully navigated this process typically did so by demonstrating, through consistent payment and careful management, that their credit risk was at least as low as their husbands had been, and then building slowly on that demonstrated reliability to the terms of credit that the operation required. The legal complications that attended commercial widowhood were considerable. Business arrangements that a husband had made informally on the basis of his personal word and reputation needed to be renegotiated in formal terms by the widow because the informal currency of frontier business credit did not automatically transfer. Debts that were owed to the deceased husband needed to be collected, and collections that a husband might have accomplished through personal presence and social pressure were more difficult for a widow to manage. Legal actions that the husband had been involved in as plaintiff or defendant continued and required the widow's engagement with the court system, whether she was prepared for it or not. It is worth noting that the frontier legal system, for all its limitations, was occasionally a better friend to widows than the social system. Courts in this period were required to apply law, and the law in most frontier territories provided widows with at least some formal protections that social pressure could not simply override. A widow who knew the law and was willing to use it had tools available to her that many of her neighbors might have preferred she not have. The women who used those tools, who appeared in court to enforce their rights, who engaged lawyers when they could afford them, and argued their own cases when they could not, were exercising a form of civic agency that the period's social norms did not entirely anticipate and did not always welcome. The social pressure to remarry deserves one more examination, because its mechanisms were more varied and more sophisticated than simple community opinion. Churches, where they existed in frontier communities, were institutions with significant social authority over domestic arrangements. Ministers who had the confidence of a community could make a widow's unmarried status a matter of pastoral concern, visiting regularly to express their worry about her spiritual and material well-being, making it socially awkward for her to resist the implicit recommendation that remarriage was the appropriate resolution to her situation. The widow, who was also a committed churchgoer, faced a particular version of this pressure because the same religious community that provided her with genuine emotional support also functioned as an instrument of social norming that pushed toward remarriage. Neighbors operated as a parallel pressure system. In small frontier communities, a widow's situation was visible in ways that urban anonymity would have prevented. Everyone knew what she had, what she owed, what her children needed, and how well she was managing. That visibility was both protective. Neighbors who noticed a widow in genuine distress might mobilize to help, and constraining. The same neighbors who helped also watched and judged and drew conclusions about her capacity to manage independently. A widow who managed too well, who demonstrated too clearly that she did not need a husband to keep her household and enterprise functional, sometimes found that her success itself was interpreted as evidence of something slightly unnatural, as if the obvious logic of female dependence had been violated in a way that required explanation. And the economic logic of remarriage was real, not just socially constructed. A frontier widow with children, an operation to maintain, and limited access to credit and labor was genuinely better off, in the narrow material calculation, with a second husband than without one. The resources a man brought, his labor, his legal standing, his credit, his social authority in the networks of frontier commerce, were not trivial. The women who chose not to remarry were not choosing between equal options. They were choosing the harder path, and they knew it. And they chose it anyway when remarriage would have cost them something they valued more than the ease it offered. What they valued, in most cases, was the legal independence that widowhood had restored and that remarriage would again suspend. The capacity to make decisions, the right to manage their own property and their own enterprise without the mediation of a husband's authority. These were things that the law of coverture had denied them during their first marriages, that widowhood had restored, and that a second marriage would again take away. For women who had experienced both conditions and understood the difference, the calculation was not simple. It was, in many cases, genuinely difficult. And the ones who chose independence over remarriage were making a clear-eyed assessment of what mattered more to them, conducted under conditions of material pressure that made the choice anything but easy. The frontier widow is not a figure of simple tragedy. She is a figure of complicated agency, operating in conditions of serious constraint, making consequential decisions with incomplete information and limited options, and producing outcomes that range from genuine accomplishment to genuine failure, with most of the actual experience falling somewhere in the complicated middle ground that history finds so difficult to narrate. What she deserves, what they all deserve, is to be seen, not through the lens of the mythology that made the frontier about male heroism and female support roles, not through the lens of sentimental tragedy that turns women's hardship into aesthetic experience, but clearly, honestly, in the complexity of what they actually faced and what they actually did. Mystery Wild West is here to give you that clarity. The real West was not the myth. The women who built it, the ones who planted and who buried and who went back to work the morning after the funeral and the morning after that and the morning after that, are the reason any of it lasted. Subscribe, share this, and come back next time, because the stories that history leaves out are always the ones most worth knowing.